おはようございます。DIC の柏木と申します。Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Hayato Kashiwagi of DIC Asia Pacific from Singapore. I've been introduced, I've started my career in the printing ink industry in 1999. I started off in the trading department of DIC, handling printing inks. After that, I was in the sales department, looking after news, commercial, and sheet-fed customers. After that, I was transitioned to my first overseas post in Thailand, where I spent 2 years looking after the same product categories. And now I'm in Singapore for my 6th year, looking after a wider scope of products within the DIC portfolio. Today, I'd like to give you a little bit of information on what is going on in the printing ink industry, as well as the news ink industry within Asia and the world. First, before I go there, I would like to give you a little bit of information about our company, DIC. I think that you are all very familiar with DIC as a printing ink company, but DIC, we consider ourselves as much more than a printing ink company. Here, I'd just like to introduce the global coverage that our company has. DIC operates under the corporate name of DIC in Japan, Asia, and Oceania, and whereas in the Americas, Europe, and in Africa, we operate under the company name Sun Chemical. We are all the same group company, DIC. DIC Group operations, we are best known for our printing inks business, but we are also very good at the technologies which have derived from the printing ink business, such as pigments, general polymers, which are resins that we use for colorants. We also have liquid colorants as well as plastic pellet colorants, and we even have businesses in the health foods area. This is just a sales breakdown of what the business of DIC looks like. Our product segment, about 50% of our business is from printing inks, and the remaining 50% comes from other chemical businesses that we have. In terms of sales by region, 48% of our sales comes from Japan, and the rest comes from the rest of the world. And Asia and Oceania makes up about 15% of our total annual sales. DIC Asia Pacific, we are basically responsible for Southeast Asia, South Asia, which covers India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, and also Oceania. That is the territory which Asia Pacific is responsible for. And in Southeast Asia, we have a coverage of majority of the large developed and developing countries within Southeast Asia, from Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. And in South Asia, we have companies in India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. All of these sites are manufacturing sites as well as selling sites of printing inks. Geographic coverage of Australia and New Zealand. I'm sure you are also very aware of the coverage that we have, but these are the areas at which we have factories, blending facilities, and also offices and distributors. All right, next, going on to a little bit about the regional review. What does the business look like within the world and within Asia? We will see that there are differences in statistics because Southeast Asia or Asia is very peculiar in a way that although we are a very small cluster of countries, each country is individual in a way that they have different cultures, different religions, different languages, the growth they have different levels of growth, literacy, population, etc. So we will see a very wide variance as to how the printing industry looks like in these countries. just to put the things into context, the world population. How does the world population look like? Based on the Business Review Weekly of May 2013, the world's population is 7.1 billion, out of which China and India account for 37% of the total global population. This is 1.385 billion in China and 1.253 billion in India, respectively. The top 11 countries, all with populations of more than 100 million, make up 60% of the total world's population, and the top 20 account for 70% of the total world's population. Asia Pacific and the Indian subcontinent make up more than half of the world's population. New Zealand is the 123rd most populous of the world's 230 nations at a population of 4.47 million. I think this data is as of 2013 May. All right. So how does that look when we put that into the print industry? Some of this data comes from an organization called PIRA, and the report, The Future of Global Printing Markets, 2011 updates, which gives us a forecast up to 2016. The printing industry is obviously changing. Some products and processes are booming in some parts of the world, where others are not doing so well. Global market for printing is forecasted to reach $845 billion US dollars by 2016, which is a 6.8% growth versus what we have in 2011. By 2011, Asia is expected to become the market share leader due to emerging markets, mainly in Asia, and is expected to hold 35% of the global market share by 2014. As of 2008, the print market by region is separated as this graph. Basically, we would be able to say that West Europe, North America, and Asia have a one-third split, or close to a one-third split throughout the globe, and East Europe, Africa, Latin America, Oceania, and the other countries would make up the balance. Leading print markets, 2006 to 2016. All units are in US dollar billions of dollars. These are the top 10 print markets throughout the globe. We can see that it is dominated by Western and more developed countries, where we see that the growth is going to be coming from the emerging countries. United States is at the dominant position since 2006. They will remain the dominant position into 2016. We will see that Japan has only maintained second place of 112 billion until 2011, and will be overtaken by China, which is showing tremendous growth of 7.8% compound annual growth ratio for that 5-year period. We can see here very clearly that the developing countries and the emerging markets like China, Brazil, and India have significant growth, and they will be leading the print market in the years to come. These are the fast-growing markets, country markets from 2011 to 2016. These are the countries at which are expected to see the highest level of growth for the next 5 years. We notice that most of them are developing countries and emerging markets, many of them coming from the Asian region. In terms of process, how is the process markets doing? The packaging industry has been strong and will continue to be strong until 2016. The packaging industry is 31% of the total print market in 2006, and they are expected to increase their share in the printing industry to 38.4% by the year 2016. So packaging we see is a very strong area or a process of growth, whereas magazines, newspapers, and catalogs are going to be seeing or are expected to see some decline in compound annual growth ratio throughout the globe. Mainly, or we do understand that there are many factors to why this would happen, but we anticipate that a lot of this has to do with new competition, such as digital devices and the internet. And so in areas like magazines, newspapers, and catalogs, where replacement can be done with digital devices, the trend will continue. However, in terms of packaging, where you need to have a tangible product and it cannot be replaced by internet, these areas will continue their growth. I'd like to touch a little bit on China, which is one of the fastest growing markets in Asia. They have about approximately 106,000 printing companies in China with an estimated workforce of 4.46 million. And so if we take that into context with the population of New Zealand, basically China would employ all of New Zealand into their printing market. And so that tells you the size of the printing industry in China. Printing ink, printing equipment, approximately 750 manufacturers. Printing inks, over 100 manufacturers. And printing materials, approximately 250 producers. So there's a lot of competition and a lot of business in China in the printing industry. Turnover for China's printing industry has always been on a growth from 2007 to 2010. Newspapers account for approximately 10% of the total printing industry. So in 2010, this would account for about 12.4 billion US dollars. Based on government surveys within the news printing industry, they took a survey in 2010 to 142 government and local newspapers, and the survey came out that they have, in 2010, 111 billion copies of newspapers in the year. And that translates to 305 million newspapers a day. Next, going on to India, which is the second most populous country within Asia. Their printing market is around 20 billion US dollars per annum, and they grew 13% from 2010 to 2011. Newspaper industry has also been doing very good. We will go into further details in the later slides. Economists have projected growth of around 8 to 9% over the next few years, and beyond 2014, the economy is expected to grow in excess of 10%. Newspapers are going to see similar increases due to multiple reasons. The increase in economy as well as increase in literacy rates will also make a very big contribution to the newspaper industry. And the price of newspaper being about 10 cents a copy is also one of the reasons, or a very big contributor, as to why the newspaper industry will be booming in India. Just going back to literacy rate that I mentioned earlier, we can see that in developed countries, the literacy rate is close to 100, and even in the emerging markets of Southeast Asia, the literacy rate is around high 80s to mid 90s. But we can take a look at India, where the literacy rate is still at 61%, which means that the remaining 39% is there as an opportunity for the printing industry. Newspapers in India, it plays a very important role in the India community, not only as an important role as a source of reliable information, but also it serves multiple purposes in their lifestyles. I'd like to emphasize on the entertainment area, where in India there are a lot of rural areas. People are still living in poverty. There's not a lot of entertainment, not a lot of things to do. And so newspapers actually act as a very important portion of their entertainment. And that is how people join together and they entertain themselves through the newspaper. Also, newspapers are used very creatively throughout the life cycle of the paper itself, whereas in developed countries, the newspaper, once it's read, it would go into the recycle bin. But in India, it still has a life cycle from there on. In many cases, the street food will be wrapped in newspapers. We don't recommend this as ink companies, but it is the way it is. To avoid the occasional monsoon, people will cover their heads with it. People will sleep in newspapers, etc., etc. So it still plays a very important part of their life cycle. This is a success story that I would like to introduce to you in India. There is a multimedia company, a major multimedia company called ABP in India. They have a daily newspaper called Ananda Bazar Patrika, and it is the leading newspaper in one of the leading newspapers in India. In September last year, they launched a local language newspaper, not an English newspaper, but a local Bengali newspaper in end of last year, which is all right. So they launched a newspaper. The commercial approach that they took was that they positioned this new newspaper as Ami Amor Mato, which is I am what I want to be, which is the psychology of the newer generation in India, which is free-spirited, forward-looking, and very energetic. The new paper came out as in tabloid format, and it was the first of its kind in Eastern India as a tabloid paper. It was very colorful, a lot of stories, and it was an immediate hit for the young generation in mind and not just in age. They did a 40 to 45-day campaign covering all of their multimedia resources, and they also gave out sweets, which is something that they do to celebrate new occasions. And it resulted in a circulation figure of 300,000 within 3 months, which immediately put them in the second largest newspaper of a local language in eastern India of Kolkata. And so they did their marketing correctly, they did their targeting correctly, and they had success, immediate success with this newspaper. Going on to a little bit about Southeast Asia, I did a comparison of Thailand, Singapore, and the Philippines. These three countries are very similar, but very different in a way. I've put the number of mid to large size newspaper companies. Thailand has 5, Singapore and Philippines 2. Supply chain. In Thailand, the newspapers are mainly delivered to homes and offices, whereas in Philippines, newspapers are mainly through retail, and there is really no home delivery or office delivery in the Philippines. Unit prices of newspapers vary accordingly. Like I said, it was 10 cents in India. In Thailand, it's about 32 cents, Singapore 70 cents, and Philippines 45 cents. Languages also differ as well. In Thailand, majority of the newspapers are in Thai, but the business dailies are usually in English. Singapore, the 2 major newspapers are in English, but the common languages that they speak in Singapore, which are Chinese, Malay, and Hindi, are also available as a daily newspaper. In the Philippines, both of the dailies are in English. Just a few remarks. Prices of newspaper in Thailand have increased by 167% over the past 8 years. It used to be 6 Thai bahts 8 years ago, and now it is up at 10. And so we have seen significant price increases for newspapers in Thailand. Singapore, both newspaper companies are owned by the government or partly owned by the government, which is one of the reasons why Singapore does get criticized at times for the freedom of speech. We get very similar articles in both newspapers at times. Being creative. Southeast Asia is also a struggling market in terms of newspaper circulation. I think that some of these things that have been seen in Southeast Asia are already present here in New Zealand and Australia. But just to give you an introduction, web-linked, which is QR codes, creative folds. I'm really not sure what you would call this, but it's similar to a gatefold, but it's only half of it. The fold over only covers half of the newspaper. Paper effect. This is using a transparent sheet of paper as the cover of the newspaper. This came out in Indonesia a few years ago. Advertisement. Belts. This is it's a strip that covers the newspaper. This particular one was with Emirates Airways. Fragrances. Perfumes, colognes, and detergents. Two ways of doing this: either put the fragrance in the ink itself or encapsulate the fragrances and put it on the press as a scratch and sniff. I have experienced this in the printing press, in the press room. You will have a very different smell for a few days, which is also very interesting. Collaboration with enterprises. Free newspaper with a morning meal. This is something that has been going on in the Philippines for a few years now. They're still doing this. Some of the companies most of them are fast food restaurants like McDonald's, Jollibee, Chowking, which are local enterprises. And even in Japan, there was a campaign last year with McDonald's Japan and the Newspaper Association of Japan, and they had free morning newspaper giveaways with a breakfast meal. From here, it's going to be a little bit of statistics on the Asian market. The regional market will include it comes from internal intelligence within DIC, and the markets will include the Greater China region, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Oceania. Greater China region for newspaper market, we have pretty much seen growth over the past 5 years. Just that we did see a significant dip in 2009 because of the global financial crisis, and this is a trend that we will continue to see throughout the next following slides. Highlight differences in the Greater China region. As I said, China has been a consistently growing market for newspapers, whereas Hong Kong has seen decline in newspaper consumption throughout the past 5 years. However, we will see on further slides that Hong Kong has an extremely high ratio of newspaper pages to population. Southeast Asia, like I said earlier, is struggling in terms of news inks or news printing. We have seen decline in the past 5 years with slight growth last year. To put things in comparison, Philippines has seen year-on-year growth for the past 6 years. And Singapore has been the opposite. But again, very similar with Hong Kong, Singapore has an extremely high ratio of newspaper pages to population. South Asia, very similar to what we saw in China, with the exception of the global financial crisis impact. They are seeing very high growth within the newspaper industry. Oceania has been hit quite hard by the global financial crisis. Other than that, they have been quite stable with the exception of 2011, where we saw an 8% decline. New Zealand has seen decline over the past few years, unfortunately, but these are the statistics that we have. Okay, next is a little bit of how much we read. Like I said earlier, I have some statistics on how many pages does one person read in a year. Just to put things into context, in New Zealand, a baby is born every 522 seconds, whereas in China, a baby is born every 1.9 seconds. And so this shows you a little bit of differences in population growth in these countries. What we've done is we have taken ink volumes, convert ink volumes into paper tonnage, and convert paper tonnage into the number of pages of tabloids, divide that by the population, and you get a tabloid page per person per country. And so these are the populations that we've used. We've translated ink volumes into paper tonnages, and we've translated paper tonnages into the number of tabloid pages. And this is the number of pages per person throughout the Asian region. We see that Hong Kong has about 25,000 tabloid pages per person per year, which is extremely high. Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand very similarly have an extremely high number of pages per person. Whereas, for example, we go to the emerging markets where the pages are still relatively low. Like in Vietnam, one person would only read 347 tabloid pages per year. And so in these areas, I think that it is good to say that we will see growth in these areas. All right, moving on to web offset. We've included the same markets as with news. However, we do see a difference in the web offset market size when we look at news cold set versus heat set. If we take a look at Australia and New Zealand, we see that the heat set market size is actually larger than the market size for cold set at about 120%, whereas in all of other Asia, heat set is not that big of a market, especially if we go to India or South Asia. Pakistan and Sri Lanka don't have heat set as a market at all, and India is extremely small compared to the size of the cold set market. So China, we've seen quite good growth over the past few years. In China, when we look at it country by country in Greater China, China is seeing slight growth. However, in Hong Kong, we are seeing year-to-year decline. In Southeast Asia, we are seeing growth from 2010. In Thailand, we see significant year-on-year growth for the heat set market here. And on the other hand, Singapore, we see year-on-year decline since 2007. South Asia, which is basically India, is increased once in 2010, but has declined for the other years. Oceania, as a whole, has declined in 2009, increased from 2010 to 2011, but we did see a slight decline in 2012. New Zealand has been quite stable since 2010. However, we did see a very slight decline in 2011 and 2012. All right, that is the portion about the markets. And I would just like to touch a little bit on printing inks, just 3 very short points on what printing ink is about. My first point is the basic technology of printing inks. Second point is regarding ink density and ink film weight. And the third point is regarding print and how the human eye sees print, and that our eyes can actually be tricked by colors under certain circumstances. This is a basic ink formula for cold set black. It is basically composed of 4 components. We have pigments, varnishes, oils, and additives. Pigments is basically the color that we add to our newspapers. Varnish is what carries the ink from the ink duct onto the paper. The oil is what sets the pigments onto the paper, and the additives is what gives it its value additions in terms of drying, scuff, etc., etc. The required characteristics has to be fluid enough to pump, but it can't be dripping on the press. It needs to be stiff, but it can't hang back in the ink duct. It has to be fluid to print, but solid enough to have low dot gain, dry on paper, but not dry on press. And so these are the challenges at which ink manufacturers face, and these are the these are the key concepts at which we try to include in our ink technology, so that we are able to come up with the best outcomes. This is a graph to explain the ink film weight versus print density. In order to achieve a print density of 1, let's say you need to have a film weight of 115. In order to get 20% higher ink density or print density, you need to have 58% more ink or more film weight. In order to get 1.3% or 130% or 30% more ink density, print density, you need to have 73% more ink film weight. And so if you have, I would imagine that usually you would have a print standard, and if you exceed print density from that print standard, you are basically putting more ink on for very little ink density effect. And so this is a slide to show you that if there is a standard, the standard should be there to follow. Otherwise, you will be wasting money on additional ink that goes onto the paper. The next one is to say that the eye can be tricked. How different are these colors? I still can't believe that this is true, but it is a fact, and it's true, that the dark color and the light color are actually of the same color. So it's very surprising, but these two colors are the same color, and that it is very easy for your eyes to be tricked when we have this kind of situation. Again, the grays, they look very different. The gray on the right looks darker, whereas the gray on the left looks much lighter, but actually they're both the same gray. And so this is a demonstration of how the eye can be tricked and the importance of managing and controlling the color on the press with spectral or devices, and which will contribute to stabilizing the quality and the color of the print. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope the information was informative and of interest to you. ありがとうございました。